Well, good evening or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. Today is rather an unusual, and in fact, it's our first podcast where I'm not interviewing a Burmese or an Anglo-Burmese, but an Englishman who spent time in Myanmar back in the early 60s. And I thought it'd be interesting to talk to him about his time in Rangoon at that period. But Guy Slater was born in December 41 in Lahore, which was, of course, then India. And he describes himself as a child of the empire, which probably makes sense. But perhaps, Guy, if you wouldn't mind telling us why you were a child of the empire.
I suppose it was sort of an inevitable moniker, really, because my father was born in India, my grandfather was born in India, and my great-grandfather also was head of a public school, a boarding school in Simla. So there were three generations of us. And as you probably know, the sort of the tendrils of empire were vast in those days. And as a schoolboy, our history books and our geography books were all read. And as kids, we grew up to this extraordinary assumption that Britain had some major role in the world. It was quickly challenged, and in my teens, I quickly dropped it. But as a small child, that's what we grew up to. So my return to later on to Burma, or Myanmar, Burma as it then was a great pleasure, and I love being back in the hot climates.
And why did Burma come into your life?
My father was first of all in Indian civil service, which is why we were in India in 1941. At independence, he moved back to London and joined the Foreign Office, and was posted to various places like Lima and in Peru, and then to Burma in, I think, 1959. And I was doing my last year at school that year, and I went out to join them in December, just before Christmas, in 1959, ready to spend 9 months or 10 months or something before I then went to university.
So perhaps you could talk about, before we go to the work that you actually did when you were there, life in Rangoon at that time, like the home you lived in and how, what a typical day was for your family.
Well, it was obviously an extremely privileged bird's eye view of Rangoon society, because my father's a diplomat. The people that we mixed were the international community, charming, intelligent, thoughtful people, and one got a fairly good, vigorous idea of what was going on at that time, with U Nu as prime minister, Ne Win lurking in the wings, but not really declaring himself, as far as any of us knew anyway. And I don't know whether I got this extraordinary lucky break, that a man called Ed Loyon, who was a significant figure in the Burmese history, a great political warrior, and the editor of a newspaper called The Nation, offered me a job for, I think, sort of £5 a week or something, or a month, I can't remember, but very little money, as a reporter on his newspaper, which for an 18-year-old was the most extraordinary privilege, because I was there with experienced journalists who knew what was going on, who taught me an enormous amount about what was going on in Burma, and I was allowed to try and follow up any story that I could lay my hands on. And I remember being cheeky enough during the water festival in Thinjan to when Chow Enlai was visiting Burma, and U Nu and Chow Enlai were celebrating, and this bloody-minded little Englishman boy ran close up to them and threw a glass of water over both of them, and they had the good grace to laugh, which I could have been arrested and sent away, but it was taken in good spirit, as the most of Thinjan in those days always was.
And where was the office of the Nation? Downtown, no doubt.
It was, and I went back to visit it. It was 44th Street, if I remember correctly, and I went back to visit it when I went back to Myanmar, to Yangon, as an adult. There was no sign of the newspaper. You climbed up some long wooden steps to the two little offices, and the presses started to roll about 10 o'clock at night. and you could hear them thundering through the building, and the whole building shook. And Ed Loyon, this lovely, extraordinary man, would send out down to the street, and we'd have food we brought up in leaves, and we'd all sit around, them squatting, and me, because my knees weren't so agile, eating the Englishmen allowed a plate and laughed at and teased for it. And we'd have supper together with all the editors, the newspaper people, and Loyon himself. It was a magical existence.
Was it that was the leading English newspaper at that time?
There was another English newspaper, possibly called The Guardian, and I can't recall. But The Nation was the newspaper of repute, really. That was the one that people looked to. So I was lucky enough, not that I could possibly understand the machinations of the politics of Burma, but I was lucky enough to be given a bit of a bird's eye view into by the reporters and the people on the staff, and the fact that, of course, going to a certain amount of diplomatic parties, you met significant people in the Burmese game.
So, what a typical day was? Obviously, I heard you finished late at night, but did it start late in the morning, or did you have to get there early, or?
Didn't get there crack of dawn. I was blessed by it. It was a golden time of my life, and I remember thinking as it was happening that I would never have such a good time again, and I think I was probably right. In a glorious country, in glorious sunshine, and blessed by a loving friendship. James Barrington, who was then Foreign Secretary, his daughter Marike had trained as a journalist at Rangoon University, Anglo-Burmese. Marike, and she came to join the Nation, and she and I were put together in the same office, and we became friends. We'd met each other. I think I'd met her. My parents gave a birthday party for me on New Year's Eve, when my birthday was around the same time, and I met Marike, and she taught me how to do the twist. I remember she said, "Imagine you have a towel and you're drying your bottom on it like that." I reminded her of this when I spoke some years ago. So Marike and I became very good friends, and indeed rediscovered joy and love and Rangoon and adventure, and it was a golden period.
So did she become like a cub reporter as well? Was that her role?
She was, but she was rather more trained than I was. I mean, she had at least had, I think, 6 months training at university, so she knew what an opening paragraph meant, which I soon learnt, but I didn't know at the time.
So she was at the University of Rangoon. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
She was. She studied journalism, and she was a poet. And she now is a dear friend of mine. Lives in America with her husband, and we see each other every few years.
Because the Barringtons were Anglo-Burmese, correct?
Yeah, both Eileen and James were Anglo-Burmese.
Right. And so we were chatting that, for me, a fascinating thing about James Barrington was that not only was he ambassador to the US and to the UN 1950 to 1955, but you mentioned how he became permanent head of the Foreign Office back in Rangoon. But he was succeeded at the United Nations by the, as you said, legendary figure, U Thant.
So, I know. It's extraordinary succession. Extraordinary.
Yeah,
it is. No, they were. He was a quiet man, James. I didn't. No one I got to know. I got to know Marike's mother better, but James was like many diplomats, rather cautious and self-contained, but clearly a formidable mind, a very clever man. Right. And we had this. We were able to go and explore whatever stories we could find. Somebody lent us a jeep. One of the reporters said, "Oh, if you want to go looking around." So I was driving this jeep, open-top jeep, around Rangoon. Marike and I, we were told that there was a great shortage of anesthetics at the Rangoon General Hospital, and we absurdly posed as Canadian medical students, which neither of us had any right to say. And we were taken around the hospital and shown them operating on people in the hospital. They were the privileges of that period for an 18-year-old boy straight out of school were exotic and extraordinary.
You know how you mentioned that Ne Win was lurking in the shadows, as it were, at that period. Did the Nation cover political stories as well, or did it play a line carefully down the middle?
the nation was quite proactive politically, I would say. There was a general sense that UNU really wasn't focusing on the critical conditions, circumstances of the country. The joke was that he was more concerned with which way a temple should be built, which way it should be facing in respect of the sun, and it's sort of the orthodox way rather than what was going on to the economy. And indeed, there was this great fear of communism in the whole of that part of the world. The Burmese Communist Party was quite effective. As you know, the domino theory was prevalent throughout the Western world, that the East was going to collapse to the fall of the communists. And so those were the main preoccupations. My reporting didn't cover that sort of stuff, but I covered stories of, some headline that I was given, I discovered some woman who had slept for 6 months. And I couldn't believe it. Allegedly, she slept for 6 months, and then woke up out of hibernation. So I wrote the hibernation story, and was again much teased for that. It was fun, and life was very privileged. There was a wonderful swimming pool where both the Burmese and Brits and the international community used to meet there. Cocaine, sounds like cocaine, but cocaine swimming pool it was called, and it was hot, it was friendly. There was parties going on. Somebody lent me a car to drive. Somebody asked me to drive his car up to Mandalay, so I had this wonderful trip driving a car with some Burmese friends to Mandalay, where we then left him the car and came back by train. Also an interesting experience. So it was a wonderful time, and with getting some insight into political machination.
And did you feel at that time, was there any anti-foreign feeling in the country because of
the history of imperialism? I didn't encounter it at all, and because I felt so lucky to be with Burmese friends, I just felt that I was with Burmese friends, and I never felt that they were discriminating against me as some wicked imperialist, because by then I'd turned against the whole notion of an empire, quite politically in my own young mind. And we all had a great time, and I asked questions the whole time. I was interested in what was going on as best as I could find out. I don't think there was much. And also the interesting thing, compared to when I went back to Rangoon years later, everybody spoke English. I mean, any taxi driver could speak English. Yeah. And I found that when I went back there 10 years ago, it was much harder to make myself. I tried to learn a bit of Burmese, but unsuccessfully.
I see you're one of 4 sons, but you're the eldest, so the others didn't really experience Burma in the same way you did.
I don't think so. My younger brother, Nigel, was still at school, so he was going backwards and forwards to school. And the 2 baby brothers, were in a small school in Rangoon. They were 5 and 6 or 7, something like that. So I was the lucky one that had access to some interesting look at how Burma.
Definitely. Yeah. And was it, you mentioned how you're in the international community, the diplomatic scene. Does that mean that even though you weren't a diplomat, you attended a lot of there'd be functions almost every night for, it was India Day or Australia Day or...
All of that, yeah. Yes. I mean, I don't think I would necessarily go to the big embassy, but we did have, my parents gave a lot of parties. We had not a grand house, but a nice house, and there was a tennis court and no swimming pool, but it was a nice house, and there was room there. We would give dinner parties, and there was a nice Burmese chef, with plenty of wine. So conversations then would flow, and I would occasionally I would go to national days as a hanger-on, as my father's son.
Right. Well, and it would have been relevant to your work too, I suppose, as a journalist.
Absolutely. Yeah, you kept your ear to the ground and picked up whatever you could find out. And if it was too big for me, I would pass it on to the news editor, and he would then assign somebody who knew much more what he was talking about than I did.
Did this change your mind? Did this period make you think, well, I'm going to be a journalist? Or what was expected of you, I suppose, was you went for some scholarship, didn't you? You won a
I
scholarship?
I came back. I got a scholarship by British Petroleum to see me through Cambridge, but that didn't last. I mean, I realized fairly early on that that was not for me, and I indeed went to my line manager and said, "Look, I'm so sorry. I don't think it's going to be for me." They very kindly kept the scholarship going till the end of Cambridge, to my parents' delight. But what I did do in Rangoon was, with Marike and many Burmese friends, we acted in something called Doctor in the House, I think it was.
Wow.
And my school had not been at all an artistic or creative school where I'd been educated. And I got the taste for acting. And then when I went to Cambridge, I wasn't really thinking about journalism. I'd begun to think about theatre. I'd had a cousin who'd been in the theatre, and an uncle who'd become quite a stinker. Murdoch, Dickie Murdoch, became quite a famous radio name. Had some knowledge of showbiz. And I went into the drama club at the Amateur Dramatic Club at Cambridge. And that's where, in the end, I decided I wanted to be. I again went into the theatre.
Guy, is that just before all the famous?
I think
it was Peter. What's
Peter
his
Cook.
Peter Cook and.
Yeah, but we had quite a cohort. Stephen Frears, the well-known international director.
Right.
Michael Nichol was an international director. Richard Eyre, who ran the National Theatre. Michael Pennington, a leading classical actor. Myself, in my own humble way, was running our own theatre and making television. I made Miss Marple for television and became a television producer, which were all quite international hits. So there was quite a cohort of our generation. And I was also lucky enough to be in the Footlights, which was
That's the one I'm thinking of. Yeah.
Yeah. I was luckily chosen to be in the Footlights, which I don't think I really deserved. I was much more of an actor than a comedian, but I did thoroughly enjoy it. And it did got me my first job in rep.
So what were you studying? Arts?
I was studying English literature.
English literature, okay.
So to some extent, the plays that I was doing fed into my course. But really, I spent more time learning lines than reading Marlowe.
So you passed out with a you can't fail, can you? You've got to get a.
I wasn't failed, but I got a 2-2. I think I got nothing very grand.
Yeah, but that you can't at Cambridge or Oxford, right? If you don't get sent down, you get a degree at the end.
You get given something. I can't remember. There's a Latin name for it, and I can't remember what it is now. Yes, that's right. So yeah, I did survive the period, and it was a good. Cambridge is a not a nerve-wracking experience. It's a very competitive environment. I think most people who've been at any big university like that, and when you're young and all flexing your muscles and so on, it's friendly and it's supportive, but it's also deeply competitive. So it was, would I say relaxing? It was enjoyable, but it wasn't relaxing because one was always.
Know immediately that you did the play in Doctor in the House in Rangoon, but did you? What were you thinking that maybe when I finish I'll go into oil or go into the diplomatic corps?
I don't think I'd ever wanted to be in the diplomatic corps because I always remember in Rangoon, funny enough, my parents had booked to this glorious beach. You may know it in northwest Burma, Thunderway, it's now called Sanderway, it was in those days.
Yeah.
It's possibly the most beautiful beach I've ever seen in my life. And we'd booked a house there, and we were told the day before we went that a government minister had overruled us and taken the house. And I was outraged that a government minister should take away. And my father said, look, we're diplomats. We can't do anything about it. And I thought, I don't want to be a diplomat. Quite unreasonable of me. Why shouldn't a minister have his holiday? But in those days, with the arrogance of an 18-year-old, I was thinking, what are they doing? He spoiled my holiday. So, no, I didn't want to be a diplomat. And I didn't really want to have the formality of those parties and having to watch one's tongue wherever one went. And I hadn't decided on the theatre, but by the time I got to Cambridge and joined the ADC and started acting and thought, yes, this is the life for me. This is where
actually you make a very interesting comment there because you did have the advantage of seeing how diplomacy worked in real life.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people who go to university and plan to be a diplomat have never, ever had the opportunity to see what's at the end of it.
No, I think my parents enjoyed their lives, but my father was an extremely able man. But he'd been part of the ICS in Indian Civil Service, so and as his father had been as well, my grandfather. So he'd sort of learned something of diplomacy in that and the Far East, of course. He lived in the Far East and spoke fluent Urdu. He didn't speak Burmese. I tried to learn Burmese, but it's not an easy language. I don't know whether you've tried. No, it's not easy. And people tried. Marike used to try and teach me, and I would parrot the noise back at her, and it wasn't very successful. But yes, I did. I saw diplomacy at first hand, and knew that I wouldn't fit in there at all.
So tell me a little bit more about. I know Miss. Of course, all Australians. I think most people around the world know Miss Marple, but you established a theatre, I think, as well, didn't you?
One of the most exciting parts of my life was, I was living in Hampshire with my two young children, Daniel and Rebecca, and my wife. And I suddenly had this extraordinary idea, driving in a car, taking some friends home. Actually, the daughter of a former diplomat, Teresa Hayter, the Hayter family. And we were driving back, and I suddenly thought, there are 4 reps. Rep was the big movement in British theatre in those days. It was an enormous movement. In Leatherhead, Farnham, Guildford, Surrey. And the other big conurbation, which is where we were nearest, was an overspill sort of new town called Basingstoke. And I thought, why don't I try and start a rep in Basingstoke? And everyone said, don't be silly, Basingstoke won't go to the theatre at all. Anyway, it became an obsession, and I became a zealot. And we did make the theatre happen, the rep happen, and we developed a main house theatre and a studio theatre, and we toured nationally and internationally. And it became, within 7 years, we even were given, the local authority gave us a disused hospital to turn it into a little mini art centre. So it was an extraordinarily heady time of very fast growth. I mean, it was, I call it kick, bollock and scramble, if I'm allowed to say that word, because it was like what my first assistant, when I was filming, used to say, we've had a hell of a bad day, call it kick, bollock and scramble. And that was what it was like for 7 years running that theatre. But it was a very significant part of my time. And the company lasted for a third of a century. So until Rep itself died.
Died everywhere, right?
Died everywhere, absolutely. Yeah. The financial model became unsustainable. So I did that and went into television, still directing in theatre from time to time. But I made a lot of series. Nanny went to Australia with Wendy Craig. I made a number of much more modern and tough series. And then Miss Marple, and then a series called Love Hurts, which I really loved with Zoe Wanamaker and Adam Faith. And then decided I'd had enough of television, and I enjoyed teaching, and I've been writing books and radio ever since then.
So you were involved with the University of California, I think.
I did. Aren't you clever? Yes, I went out to teach twice, I think. Yes, twice. I went out to direct a show and to teach either screenwriting screenwriting on one occasion and directing on another. And a very enjoyable semesters they were.
But not tempted to move to California?
No. I wanted to be in the thick of in the belly of the beast in the industry that I had come to know. Was enjoying making theatre in the UK.
And you still dabble with it, right?
I'm 81 years old now. I don't do so much in terms of production, and I don't know whether I mean, nobody would be foolish enough to offer me a production now. I'm writing, and I did direct a play last year. A stage play.
That's at 80.
Right.
So
yes, I did. Whether if something came up and the conditions were right, and then I would look at it. But I don't tout myself any longer as a director.
And I think one of your children has followed in the business, as it were, or in the theatre.
My son, a very distinguished opera director. He goes all over the world directing opera. My daughter had the good sense to become first a lawyer and then a teacher. And she's a mother with 4 children and got a very busy life. And Daniel has a daughter who's now in America, but he is very much an active opera director. So he he cut his teeth working for me in my little theatre, playing Tiny Tim in Christmas Carol.
Did he really?
He always tells me that he stole the show. He tells me.
If you look back, I think from what you've said, that 8 months, 9 months that you spent was a significant part of who you are today.
I'm very much so. The young third secretary who was in the embassy in those days, called Martin Morland, subsequently became ambassador to Rangoon and was there indeed when I went back out there. And he asked me to join a charity that he had helped form, which he was chairman, called Prospect Burma, which has flourished now for nearly 40 years. And I'm a trustee of Prospect Burma, and we raise money every year to provide education scholarships both in country and outside, and online learning, and a whole range of things, because
wonderful.
We believe, like many people do, that education is the route to renewal.
Absolutely. And has that been affected by the latest coup? And do you know whether you're still up?
Oh, yes. I mean, we have to move very carefully.
Yeah.
Our Burmese team have now left Burma and operating elsewhere. So most of the work is done online, but I think we got something like 10,000 applications for scholarships this year.
Wow! And you can't possibly give all those, can you?
Possibly. We know it's a small charity. We raise as much money as we can. We just got a prize draw going for an auction of a painting that Aung San Suu Kyi, when she was still in favour, presented to us, and we're auctioning that to try and raise money. We're always trying to raise money to provide scholarships in Rangoon, well, not in Rangoon, in Burma, in Myanmar.
So the link continues. The relationship.
I've been back there twice, and I didn't go back when Aung San Suu Kyi advised Friends of Burma not to go while the military were in. I went back for the first time when she was notionally under house arrest, but it was clear that she was going to be released. Right. And she was kind enough to invite us to her house. So
on the lake.
On the lake, indeed.
Yeah.
And I went with the person I was traveling with, Caroline Corto. And we had this 3 hours with this remarkable, as she then was, woman. And I've been back. I wrote a play set in Myanmar about the 1988 revolution, which was put on in London and then on radio. And they picked that up for the Mandalay Literary Festival about 3 years ago. So I went out, luckily had a lovely time in Mandalay presenting the radio version, I hasten to add.
See all these other things that you've been doing with Myanmar that I had no idea of.
No, it's kept me in touch. It's kept me more or less in touch.
Has.
It's clearly a very depressing time now, because it's very difficult to make contact with people, and it's a frightening time for anybody who wants to try and see democracy restored.
Absolutely. So, Guy, look, thank you very, very much for giving me your time and telling us about your many links.
I haven't rambled too much for you, I hope.
Not at all. Thanks, Guy. Thank you.
Cheers. Hi, Peter. Thank you.